Hello, welcome to our NetScaler webinar today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. My name is Rich Rushton. I will be the moderator for the webinar today, and our presenter will be one of our Citrix certified instructors here at LayerA Training. His name is Matthew Jones, and some of you may have even taken a class with Matthew before. We're glad that you joined us today. We're going to try to keep the webinar, it'll definitely be less than 1 hour, and we're going to leave some time at the end for questions and answers. And before I officially turn the time over to Matthew, I just want to give everyone a little bit of information about our organization, LayerA Training. Okay, so some of you are probably familiar with LayerA Training. We're the largest Citrix training partner in North America, and really what that means is we run the most classes and train the most students on Citrix in North America. We have 5 full-time Citrix trainers on staff. We also collaborate with Citrix on course development. In fact, we're currently working on NetScaler course content with Citrix. So the next release of the NetScaler training is actually going to be written by our instructors. We did want to mention that we try to run frequent promotions. We do have a promotion that's going through the end of March, and that is if you purchase a 5-day Citrix class from LayerA Training, you will receive a gift valued at $500. In lieu of that, you could also choose to receive a discount on the training. So for more information on that, you can go to our website, or you can send us an email or give us a call. Now I'm going to turn the time over to Matthew Jones, which is the reason all of you guys are here today. And you can see some of Matthew's credentials on this slide here. Matthew is an absolutely brilliant trainer. He currently resides in New York, so he teaches the majority of our New York courses and also many of our virtual classes. I am now going to turn the time over to him, and I'll check back in at the end of the webinar for the question and answer session. Okay, Matthew, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rich. So we're going to talk today about the integration of NetScaler with XenApp and XenDesktop. We usually go in and do these webinars, and we get into kind of one core product and then kind of talk about what's new, what's exciting, what's upcoming. Rich came up with this awesome idea and said, what if we kind of can put a little bit of a twist on it? So we tossed it around, and what we've come up with is kind of more of a demo and kind of an explanation of some of the really neat functionality from the NetScaler that you can bring to your XenApp and XenDesktop environment. So we're going to go in and talk about the NetScaler as kind of a load balancer, what that entails, how we can go in and load balance a few core services like LDAP and DNS and things like that. We'll talk very briefly about XenApp and XenDesktop architecture, what that might look like in the environment, and then how you can tie together those 2 components, load balancing from the NetScaler with your XenApp and XenDesktop, and how we can even go in and monitor the back end, make sure it's up and available before we send traffic there. Then what I want to do is kind of go a little bit above and beyond and talk about remote access. So we'll go in and talk about the NetScaler Gateway and how we can bring users in remotely to connect to our XenApp and XenDesktop environment on the back end, and then hopefully be able to talk a little bit about some of the reporting functionality that's in there thanks to what's called HDX Insight. We'll talk about the Insight Center, how to go in and set that up, and then what type of statistics and things we can grab from our NetScaler Gateway about users coming in remotely. So one of the premises that we got to cover is, what is a NetScaler? If you're not familiar with it, the NetScaler itself is actually a web application delivery controller. We call that an ADC. We've kind of migrated away from just being one size fits all, and this is a load balancer and that's all it does, to the Swiss Army knife of networking tools. So you'll see the term application delivery controller used a lot more to describe this product suite than just a load balancer or just a VPN concentrator or just a firewall. So the NetScaler is a application delivery controller. Like I said, you might be buying it for load balancing. So yeah, it provides layer 4 load balancing. We'll go in and talk about that, and I'll show you exactly what that looks like. It's also got some really advanced functionality. We go in and you've got what's called the application firewall, probably the most powerful feature on the NetScaler. Able to look at application layer traffic, determine do we want this in, do we not want this in, and be able to prevent certain types of attacks. So you might have traffic that actually gets through your network firewall, but the application firewall is looking at what's going on. Is this a buffer overflow attack? Is it a SQL injection attack or cross-site scripting or things like that, and is able to go in and provide that protection for it. The SSL VPN capability, this is, it comes from the NetScaler Gateway feature. It could be a full-fledged SSL VPN. You can also go in and use it for clientless VPN access to portal to something like OWA or SharePoint on the back end. We also use this if you're coming from a XenApp and XenDesktop environment because of ICA proxy. We want to be able to bring remote users in. We don't necessarily want them to have to set up a full SSL VPN. How do we provide access to applications and desktops remotely? And the NetScaler Gateway gives us that capability. And then kind of to touch on what XenApp and XenDesktop is, this is your app and desktop virtualization solution. It combines the ability to go in and centrally manage your apps and desktops in the data center, and then thanks to the ICA protocol and the Citrix receiver, you get remote access to that data from any device anywhere. Anything in the receiver for Windows, Mac, Linux. There's thin clients, tablets, smartphones. The list goes on and on. There's a Citrix receiver out there for almost every device. You can use that to connect to the data center and interact with these applications and desktops on the back end. So these are two very core products in the Citrix arsenal, and we're going to take a look at how they actually interact with each other today. Here's where we're going to jump in and get away from PowerPoint and actually take a look at what some of the capability is, and I'll be going in and showing you a lot of theoretical concepts and then implement them out on the NetScaler and let you see what's going on. We teach whole classes on this concept. This week I'm in New York working with some guys on the NetScaler for XenApp and XenDesktop, and we dive specifically into how to do everything that you're going to see in the next 40 minutes here. So hopefully everybody is strapped in. It's going to be a fun presentation here. So what I've got is I've got a lab environment set up. What you'll see here is I've got 16 different virtual machines. Some of these you might recognize. You guys should know what a domain controller is. You should know what a NetScaler is. I just mentioned that. And then we've got some XenApp specific stuff on the back end. We've got a couple of delivery controllers from a XenDesktop 7.6 deployment. We've got storefront for internal access to those XenDesktop resources, and then we've got actual XenDesktop resources. What is it we are delivering? Could be apps, could be desktops. There's a whole range of capabilities of that actual product. And then I've got over here, I've got the diagram for this, and I can go in and kind of show you. Here's the theoretical, diagram of the architecture of the environment. And so what I've got is I've got my internal environment over here on the right, and this is all of my resources I just showed you. I mentioned a pair of domain controllers. That's my DNS, my LDAP, my authentication. Delivery controllers for XenDesktop are in here. Here's my storefront and some different resources like that. All of this would be in my secure backend environment. And then I've got a NetScaler that I'm going to be able to go in and use for providing load balancing of these resources. And then eventually we're going to go in and set up the external access so an external user can come in and connect to the NetScaler through the NetScaler Gateway, and it will do ICA proxy to storefront or their backend resources. And so this is kind of the big picture of what we have in the environment. What I've got over here is a couple of tasks that have already been done. So when I go in and show you the NetScaler, it is somewhat basically configured. so it will pass traffic. It is licensed. It is set up to communicate using one of the later builds of NetScaler version 11. Some people in a modern deployment might be using 10.5. We're going a little bit cutting edge here and using the 11.0 version. If you worked with the NetScaler, or maybe if you haven't worked with it, you might be familiar with the Java implications that go along with that and the GUI. Fortunately, when you get to the 11.0 version, you've actually got a Java-free NetScaler that makes it really easy to just go in, connect to this management IP address, and be able to go in and put in our configurations. In the past, might have been a 2-hour ordeal trying to get the right version of Java to work with the right version of the NetScaler just so we can go in and do configuration. Fortunately, in the 11.0 era, that has actually gotten a whole lot easier for us. And so what I want to do is I want to go in and talk a little bit about how to go in and do some load balancing. So when we look at the environment, and what I've got here is kind of a template for talking about this. I've got two servers in the environment, Domain Controller 1 and Domain Controller 2. And you can see these guys sitting up here. These are the IP addresses that go along with them. Okay? On the NetScaler, what we can do is we can go in and actually set it up so that a client can connect to the NetScaler, and then the NetScaler will connect to the back end. And in this case, we want to load balance or distribute traffic between these guys. Okay? Now, the first requirement of this is that these guys are identical, which is easy when we're talking about domain controllers. You've got your zone replications and things like that. It doesn't matter which one you talk to. Okay? They both can do DNS. They both can do LDAP. So we can connect to either one of these. So what we can do is we can go in and put in a configuration on the NetScaler where we can go in and send clients to the NetScaler, and then the NetScaler can make a decision about how to load balance that traffic. Okay? So I want to go in and kind of show you what that would look like from a concept here. Okay? And so what we would do is we would go in and configure 3 different objects on the NetScaler to make this happen. Okay? This first tier of objects that we would go in and create are what we would call server objects. We would go in and tell the NetScaler, here's some objects on the back end that we want to go in and talk to. Okay? In this case, we're talking about Domain Controller 1 and Domain Controller 2. So what we would do is we would go in and create server objects. Okay? So here's my server for AD1. And very basic config, you just tell it what that IP address is. Okay? And so we go in and say, I want you to be able to talk to this server. That's all we have to go in and do. Okay? I want to be able to talk to the other one, so I create a server object for it. And I say, here's the IP address of it. And this gives me entities on the back end that my NetScaler can go in and talk to. Okay? Now, these are not really intelligent objects. We don't have a lot going on. The command line for this is incredibly simple. You're just going in and saying, create the object, give it a name, give it an IP address. Okay? If you go in and want to look at the stats for this, it's going to be name, IP address, and then it's going to have a state, which is going to be enabled or disabled. Okay? This is a good place to send traffic or not, based off of what the administrator says. So you're not doing any active monitoring here. You're just saying, we should go talk to these guys for some reason. The actual reason we talk to them is going to be defined in the next tier of objects, which is called a service. Okay? And so what we would do is we would go in and create a service object to create a port and protocol relationship to the back end. So if we're talking about load balancing DNS, okay, let's just start with that. What we would do is we would go in and say we want to create a service for DNS. Okay? That service is going to be located on that first domain controller. So we can go in and say it's hosted on server Active Directory 1. And then you identify the port and protocol that we're working with. And this is going to be DNS traffic. Okay? The NetScaler is protocol aware of a lot of different protocols. Okay? So what we can do is we can go in and say, okay, this is DNS traffic on port 53. And what it does is it creates a port and protocol relationship to this specific server. Okay? And so this lets us go in and say, okay, this might be one place where we could go to resolve DNS queries. Okay? Now, I got two options, so I would go in and create a second service. So here's DNS2 tied to the server object for Active Directory 2. Again, still DNS on port 53. Now, some of you guys may be familiar with NetScaler concepts, and you may look at this and say, okay, I want to put in service groups and simplify that down. Great. Okay? That's a little bit more of an advanced concept. We go in and we cover that in a week-long class. Here, just the general concept of NetScaler to backend. Okay? Now, when you go look at the server objects, these guys are enabled or disabled, but these guys are actually going to be up or down. Okay? And what they've got is they've got a monitoring component where they go in and they're actively testing the back end to make sure this is up and available. Okay? And you've got two default monitors. Since this is a UDP-based protocol, it would go in and use what's called a ping default. It would just simply ping the back end. Does it get a response? Great, back end is up. Or if it doesn't get a response, it would say the back end is down. Not a good place to go in and send traffic. One of the things you'll realize is that the NetScaler's got a lot of capabilities for doing active monitoring in the back end. These are DNS servers, so if we wanted to, we could actually test DNS functionality. Ask it to resolve a domain name, do we get back a response? I can even go so far to say, resolve this domain name, and then I can say, here's the known values that are acceptable. And then I can look at how it would resolve to make a decision about, is this guy up or down? Okay? So, a lot of powerful capability about maintaining the NetScaler to back-end communication. The other thing we can do here is we can go in and we can do the client side of things. This is what we call a load balancing vServer. And so this is going to be where clients are going to send their traffic to make sure that they can communicate to the NetScaler. So this would be a load balancing virtual server, which is going to be responsible for my DNS. So what I do is I go in and I give this thing a name. It says what type of virtual server. We're dealing with DNS traffic, so I'd say DNS. And then what you would do is you would go in and give this an address. And this address is going to be called a VIP. And that's a virtual IP address. It's owned by the NetScaler. That's where the clients would be sending their DNS queries to. So what I can do is I can go in and say, I want you to communicate to the NetScaler using the IP address 10.0.0.99. And then it's DNS, so it's going to be port 53. You've got all sorts of options that can go in here. We can go in and configure our load balancing method. I've got options. How do I choose between them? You might need persistence. So each protocol is going to have different types of persistence to go in and say, okay, you previously sent me to DNS server 1, continue to send me there. And so we can go in and configure all sorts of properties for what's going on here. With DNS, it's very transactional. You make the request, that's it. You make the request, you get back a response, end of transaction. Your next DNS lookup can totally go to the next server, and that's just fine. In instances where it's not, we can go in and use persistence to make that play out the way we want it. So what you've got here is you've got kind of a conceptual idea of what load balancing is. Now, I did this based off of an actual lab environment, so I actually have these servers. If you go look at my lab diagram, these guys are actually sitting back here, so I can go in and tell my NetScaler, here's 2 domain controllers. I want to be able to talk to them using DNS on port 53, and then I can go in and build this out to say, connect to this back end, and let's do load balancing for DNS. Let me show you what that looks like real quick. Now I'm going to go in and do this kind of in a tricky manner here. What I've got is I've got this management workstation set up. This will let me go in and connect to my NetScaler. So this gets me connected to my NetScaler for management. I can come in here and put in the IP or put in the default username and password. Like I said, it's partially set up. So it's got the IP addresses and everything that I need for the NetScaler to be able to talk to the back end. And so what I want to do is I want to go in and set up the server objects, the services, and the load balancing virtual server. Now, I'm going to cheat on this. I've actually gone in and put the configuration already in place. So all I really need to do is just go in and say, create these objects for me. And so I've got a mechanism for going in and doing that. And so I've got a script in here, and I can go in and say execute this. And then what it's going to do is it's going to go in and run the command line to create all those objects I just showed you. So you see the batch file pop up. I just do this in the interest of time. I could go in and actually create all these objects. Here's the command line to go in and do it. Create 2 servers, create my 2 services using those servers, create the load balancing virtual server, tie it all together. If I close out of this and you go look at your NetScaler config, what you get is you actually get those objects. Here's load balancing. Here's servers we might want to talk to. Here's my port and protocol relationship to those servers. You'll see they've got a state. They're in an up state. That means that I'm able to go in and say, let's talk to them, and they respond back. Right now, it's just using ping. I could go in and be much more elaborate if I needed to. Here's my virtual server. So I've got an address that you could connect to. It's 10.0.0.99. That's what we call a VIP on the NetScaler. And if a client wanted to send traffic to that, they can go in and resolve things to the back end. A simple way to go in and test this, I can launch my command prompt. I can use the NSLOOKUP command. And what I can do is I can change my, it's already set up. It's ready to send queries to the NetScaler. And so what I would do is I'd go in and say, can you resolve gateway.training.lab? And what it's going to do is it's going to send a query to the NetScaler. NetScaler is going to load balance it to one of the DNS servers on the back end, and I get a response. And so this is my client sending DNS queries to a NetScaler, NetScaler load balancing those to the back end. If you go in and look at the capabilities here, we can go in and we can do the exact same thing with LDAP. Okay, if I want to go in and do load balancing of authentication, what I would do is I could go in and create a load balancing scenario, okay, and I could actually use these exact same objects. So I can just copy this down here, and what I can do is I can go in and create a service for LDAP. So this would be LDAP1. It's going to be hosted on this domain controller here. So I just reuse that server object. And there are several protocols in NetScaler's protocol aware of. What I can do is I can actually scale back and actually, there's not LDAP at layer 7. So I could go look at it at layer 4 and actually say, okay, this is TCP traffic. So it's TCP traffic on port 389. And I can do the exact same thing here. And so this goes in and gives me a relationship to the back end to go in and say, let's use LDAP from here or here. And then on the front end, I can create a load balancing virtual server for LDAP. Again, protocol's not on there, so we go with TCP traffic, give it some address on the front end, and then go in and say we're using port 389. Again, all the options that I mentioned we had with load balancing, you've got there. So you can go in and say, let's load balance this using round robin, least connections, whatever the case may be. If I want to see this in production, I've got it already scripted out. So go in and create those objects. I'll just launch the script that I created to go in and set up load balancing, throw this on here, and then what it will do is it'll create these services. It'll create the load balancing virtual server, and then tie it all together for me. And then you can see the command line that goes along with it. If you go look at what this actually did for us, if I jump back down here to my load balancing, I've got the same servers, but now I've got services for LDAP and a load balancing virtual server. So if I needed to do LDAP authentication, here's a place I could go in and do that. Now, how does this concept relate to XenApp and XenDesktop? So let's jump over here and actually take a look at what XenApp and XenDesktop would look like. What you've got is you've got an access method. For those of you guys that have been around the product for a while, you might be familiar with web interface. The newer way of accessing the environment is through storefront. And I've actually got a pair of storefront servers. And then you've got, in XenApp, we used to have XenApp controllers. Okay, there are XML brokers. In XenDesktop, we traditionally called these the desktop delivery controllers. In modern era, they're just called delivery controllers. And with XenDesktop 7, the XenApp and XenDesktop functionality is a single architecture. And then just depending on licensing and how much you pay for it, it goes in and gives you just app functionality, just desktop functionality, or both. So here's my delivery controllers. These guys have what's called a broker service running on them. And this broker service has what's called the XML component to it. And so if you're familiar with the environment, what will traditionally happen is you set up web interface or storefront and you tell it, here's my XML brokers, or here's my delivery controllers. And it sets up an XML communication to the back end, specifically for doing authentication of users, and specifically for being able to enumerate user resources. And so what we can do is these guys are tied to a database that has all of those settings in them. So it doesn't matter which of these you talk to, they can both authenticate you and they can both get the same resources. So if it doesn't matter which one you talk to, that's a good indication that we could go in and do load balancing. So what I can do is I could go in and say, let's load balance these two servers. And then just from a consolidated standpoint here, what we could do is we could go in and say, let's load balance the XML service, which let's do the service for XenDesktop 1, obviously on the server for XenDesktop 1. Traditionally, this has been using HTTP as the communication mechanism. It's been more of a best practice now to secure that. So your protocol in some environments might be HTTP. In modern environments, you'll probably see SSL. So I can go in and say, let's communicate to these guys using SSL on 443. And I got another option here. The other controller, like this, also using SSL on 443. And then on the front end, I can go in and say, okay, I'm going to send my traffic to a load balancing virtual server for XenDesktop. The type here is going to be SSL. And then I can go in and grab an address to use on the front end. And I'll do something like this. 10.0.0.21 SSL, so we use port 443. If you're not familiar with it, these guys are very transactional. You're going to say, here's a username and password, authenticate them, and give me back a list of resources. And that's all they do. As a separate transaction, you might come in and talk to these guys and say, a user needs to launch this application. They would then get their application launched, and the delivery controller would respond and say, here's your application. What I'm getting at is these things are very transactional, so there's no real need for persistence here. So I can go in and put in place this configuration specifically. Now, what they do here is we can go in and tie this in with DNS. So when I set up my storefront to say, here's your delivery controllers, instead of sending them to controller 1 and controller 2, I can send them to, and then they use a clever name in the lab. They call it Nimbus, kind of a cloud. Maybe some of you guys are Harry Potter fans. Whatever works. So they can go in and use a DNS entry here to say, let's send them to nimbus.training.lab, and then that's going to resolve to this NetScaler address. So to actually take advantage of this, what I would do is go in and configure my store and say the actual backend is nimbus.training.lab. And what that's going to do is that's going to point my storefront servers to go talk to the NetScaler to get to one controller or the other. And so what I've done is I've introduced all of the capability of the NetScaler, load balancing, active monitoring, things like that, into my deployment. So now if one of these guys goes down, the NetScaler is going to know it. So when storefront talks to the NetScaler, it's only going to send the user's request to a storefront server that's up. Let me show you how we go in and put this in place. Real quickly, what I've got is I've already got a certificate on here. So I've brought in a wildcard certificate, got this installed, and so when I go in and create entities with SSL, I need to go in and have a certificate for those load balancing entities. And then, of course, like you guessed, instead of actually showing you the steps of creating the server, service, load balancing virtual server, and tying it all together, I've got a batch file for that. You'll be able to see the commands. Here's XenDesktop, should open up, and then you'll actually see it execute creating those objects. So there's server 1, there's server 2 for my controllers. Here's the service to give me SSL on port 443 to those guys. Here's my SSL virtual server, bind it to those two services to say I've got options, here they are. And then the last piece is throwing in the SSL certificate. If I wanted to actually be able to take advantage of this, let me show you a little bit of the infrastructure real quick. Here's my actual DNS server, and on the DNS server, here's the DNS manager. And what they've got is they've got an A record already set up. So you can send your request to nimbus.training.lab. That resolves to, and then the IP address you see is the address on the NetScaler. The way you use this is I would go to my storefront server, and then I would open up my storefront config, and the way that it's been configured in the past is to go in and say, go talk to controller 1 or controller 2, and it lists them out independently. What I can do is I can go in and say, let's change that, and I can say, instead of going in and talking to controller 1 and controller 2, I can use that FQDN to get them to the NetScaler. So now my storefront environment will go in and talk to the NetScaler to get to one controller or the other. And then kind of as a final step with storefront, if you're not familiar with this, you've got multiple storefronts and they use a standardized configuration. What happens is you go in and you've got a server group, and hopefully my snap-in doesn't crash on me. But what happens is you've got a server group, and you go in and tell that server group, here's a change to the config, make sure everybody's on the same page. And so I should be able to go in and propagate this out, and then both of my storefront servers know to use the NetScaler for load balancing to the back end. Now, before I do this, maybe I want to load balance storefront. And what happens is you've got a base URL here that says how are the users coming in, and it says they're going to one storefront server or the other. What I could do is I could say, let's actually send them to one of those FQDNs that gets you to a load balancer on the NetScaler. So if I want to load balance storefront, I can go in and do that. They've already got the FQDN set up, so I can go in and generically connect to storefront.training.lab, have that take me to a NetScaler, and have a NetScaler load balance me to one storefront server or the other. So I'll go in and put that in place, and then we'll roll out the config, and then the user can actually go to one storefront server or the other once this updates. And then I go in and say, let's make sure everybody's on the same page, propagate the changes, and then all I need to do is go in and tell my NetScaler, let's load balance storefront servers. And of course, as you guessed it, I've got a batch file for that. And you'll see when this executes, it's going to go in and create my two server objects. They've got IP addresses, .17 and .18. I'm going to go in and set up a SSL connection to them. That's the new best practice for working with storefront, is that you should be connecting to it using SSL. So I've got my SSL connection. Here's my load balancing virtual server. It's got a VIP. The client can connect to it. Now, persistence is required here. When you log into storefront, you are setting up a connection to that server. So I can't go in and just switch between one server and the other. My client needs to connect to the server that they originally connected to. So I can very easily go in and involve persistence. I'm going to keep track of their IP addresses, and then where I load balance them initially, I'm going to continue to send them there. So what I do, throw this in place, and then I've got a load balanced storefront environment. If you want to see it in action, let me open up a browser here. I can come in, connect to HTTPS. The FQDN that we're using is storefront. So here's storefront.training.lab, and then what happens is my browser is connecting to the NetScaler, and then the NetScaler is load balancing me to one storefront server or the other. And then because I've got persistence, I'll continue to get sent to that same server. So now I'm talking to storefront, and if I log in, it would enumerate resources. You'd be able to go in and see that. So this is kind of an example of how we can load balance our XenApp and XenDesktop resources from the NetScaler. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to kind of show you what the gateway function looks like. This is the ability to bring users in remotely. And so what they're going to do is they're going to come in and connect to a NetScaler, and what I'll do is I'll set it up. It's going to be a full SSL VPN, and then I can go in and use what's called a session profile to say specifically, I want to go in and just work with XenApp and XenDesktop. I just want my user to connect to storefront and then be able to do ICA proxy to XenApp and XenDesktop resources. So what I can do is I can come in here and go in and run through the configuration for this. So you'll see as part of my options, I've got the NetScaler Gateway, and they've also got what's called a NetScaler Gateway Wizard. It does kind of open up a new window, so it goes full screen. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and say I want an entity that users can come in from external and get access to internal resources. This is the exact same way you would set it up if you really wanted full SSL VPN. It's going to create a gateway. What is the address that clients are going to connect to? So I would go in and say this is 10.00.30. That's going to be a VIP on the NetScaler. We've already got that set up in DNS so that that's the address you can come into using the gateway.training.lab URL. In fact, I'll go ahead and give this guy a name. Here it says users might come in using the wrong protocol. Do you want to redirect them? And so if they come in using HTTP, let's redirect them. I throw this in place. Great. It says it's an SSL VPN, so a certificate's required. Already got that in place. Then what I can do is it goes in and says, how do you want to handle authentication? What I could do is I could go in and say, let's just use local authentication, and I could create a local account here. If I wanted to, and I may do this in the interest of time, just to go in and kind of expand this out, I could go in and say, actually, let's bring them in using LDAP. And then you guys know that I've got an LDAP load balancing virtual server in place. I can go in and take advantage of it. Let's talk with LDAP too, and then this is that load balancing VIP that I had just set up when I said we could load balance LDAP. On the back end, my domain is the training.lab domain. So training.lab, we've got a service account that can go in and authenticate these users. So I put that in place. There's a password for it. And this is going to go in and create my policy in my server to go in and give me access to authenticate users with LDAP. So I go in and say they're going to be putting in their SAM account name. If I want to do two-factor authentication, the gateway can do that. I'll just go in and simplify this down. So it creates the authentication server and the authentication policy, and then it puts it in place for me. So what I should wind up with is a gateway on the NetScaler that users can come into for a full SSL VPN. If you want to see briefly what that looks like, come in here. And then what this is a page being presented by my NetScaler to go in and authenticate me. Now, initially, this is going to be for bringing users in for full SSL VPN. So what I can do is I could go in and say, this is Citrix admin, put in my credential. It's then going to authenticate me and offer me full SSL VPN. If that's not entirely what I want, I can go in and control this a little bit better, which is kind of what ICA proxy is going after. If you're coming from the XenApp and XenDesktop side, you're less concerned about the full SSL VPN and more concerned about how do I go in and have somebody log into that black screen and then the next thing they see is storefront. And so what we would do is we would go in and create a session profile, and those are, a profile is a collection of settings for the appliance. And then you can go in and bind that to a user or a group or the virtual server in general. So everybody that comes in, here's the settings that apply. When you run through the wizard, it goes in and sets that up for you automatically. So if you go in and look, there is already a session policy, and the settings are here in a session profile. What I can do is I'll go in and create my own. And so here's my session policy for ICA. Where are these settings? And so I would go in and create a profile for those settings. A couple of things that you need. As far as the DNS server, I can go in and configure that globally if I need to. From the client experience, you're going to have a few different issues, and sometimes this isn't well documented. There's a setting here for single sign-on to web applications. This allows my user to authenticate to the gateway and then be able to pass through the authentication to storefront. We don't want them to authenticate to the black screen and then to the green screen. I can then go in and change the security. I want you to have access to stuff on the back end. So this is a permissions concept. And then ICA proxy is controlled by these published applications here. So what I can do is I can go in and say, I want to do ICA proxy. Here's a setting that says, to what? And I'd say, go talk to storefront.training.lab. You guys know that's the load balanced storefront. And then what I would do is I'd go in and say, connect to Citrix Store Web. And then that means the next page that you would see would be the storefront. If I jump in here and say, you're coming from the training.lab environment, and then the Citrix receiver homepage, usually same options as up here. So let me type that out. Not sure why it won't let me go in and edit that. It's got a problem where I went and pasted some text in there, and now it won't let me take it out. Not a NetScaler issue, it's my interface with it. But what you do is you'd go in and configure this, and then what it's going to do is it's going to set up the settings so that the next thing you would see would be your XenApp and XenDesktop. Goes in and says, when do you want this to take effect? I would go in and use an NS true value to say always. Put this in place, and then the general rule about policies is a policy must be bound to take effect. So what I do is I go in here to my virtual server. You've got down here, you've got the policies it created previously when it set up the NetScaler. So what I do is I go in and get rid of the default one, and then I would throw in my new one. So I put that in place, and what this is going to basically do is it's going to go in and connect me to storefront as soon as I authenticate. Now, the other thing you got to watch out for is there actually is a storefront configuration that you have to do to go in and say users are coming in from a gateway. So it's not set up to actually authenticate users from storefront. You have to go in and actually say that. So you've got your authentication methods, and you can go in and say they're coming in through a storefront or through a gateway. It's going to ask you what that gateway is. So I would need to go in and actually put that in place. And then I would go in and say, enable remote access. And then that would go in and help me be able to bring my user in using the gateway. Final step that's in there is my users are coming in remotely. And we don't go in and actually put the information about the resource into the ICA files. You don't want to leak out your internal architecture out on the internet. So what you would do is you would involve what's called an STA, and it's kind of like a valet ticket for your session. It goes in and says, here's where your session is, and then you would go in and say, tell the NetScaler, go talk to the valet, they'll get the session for you. Show you that real briefly. I won't show you the other side of the config, but here's where you go in and say users are coming in remotely. It says, how do I get them to this remote access piece? And so this would be the gateway. And then it wants to go in and verify they authenticated. And so you would go in and tell them, here's where my NetScaler is. Here it says, how do I go in and talk to or get the ticket that I mentioned earlier? I'll just use one of these. Usually you'd go in and configure 2 of them. I put that in place, and then the final step to make storefront work is to go in and say, let's let users come in remotely. So enable remote access. They're not coming in through a VPN. They're coming in through this guy. Again, your final step on that would be to go in and actually say, use this. I'm going to cut a corner here real quick. And I configured storefront 1. So what I'm going to do is just say, let's turn off storefront server 2. My NetScaler is smart enough to realize that server goes down and won't load balance users there, and I don't have to wait to propagate my changes. If you need to go in and do management, or not necessarily management, some of the monitoring of this, they've got a component in here for Insight. And with Insight, what it does is it goes in and is grabbing statistics about users coming in through the environment. And so what you can do is you can go in and get some valuable information about what users are connecting to in your environment. There's a web component for this, very, very powerful. If you're not familiar with what Insight does, it's got a web component that will go in and grab some really valuable statistics about what your web traffic is connecting to. But if you've got the Enterprise or Platinum edition of the NetScaler, you can go in and get some really valuable information about what your ICA clients are connecting to. So you go in and tell it about your NetScaler, and then it will go in and do all of your configuration for how to talk to the back end. And so it will go in and create your policies. It will say, grab statistics about what's going on, dump them off to this appliance. This is the configuration node. And so you can go in and you can put your configuration in place. Once you've got it set up, you go into your dashboard and you can get some really valuable statistics about the traffic that's coming in and out of your gateway. So anytime a user goes in and they connect remotely, what's going to happen is your user's going to come in, you're going to be able to see that they connected, and when they actually launch an application, which I still had a few pieces to put in place here, what would happen is your NetScaler Gateway would start grabbing statistics about what they're connected to, what your bandwidth looks like, what your resources look like. And it would go in and actually start giving you charts and graphs about overall throughput in your environment. So anytime a user is coming in through the gateway, this is what you would be able to grab statistics for. Now, I could log in and it would pull up the storefront page, but it wouldn't launch the apps. So I can't really go in and grab those statistics for you. But you can kind of see where a lot of this ties together. So you've got XenApp and XenDesktop. You've got the NetScaler. You've got Insight Center for your monitoring. And for those of you guys familiar with the desktop, the XenDesktop product, if you've got Director, you can go in and get some valuable information out of that Insight piece to really see what users are able to come in and do or what they're accessing. It will give you some really awesome charts and graphs about the user experience through the gateway. Now, I know we went a little bit long on that, and there's all sorts of cool stuff. Obviously, there's a whole week worth of stuff related to going in and configuring it and stuff like that. But we'll go ahead and wrap it up. You've kind of seen a little bit of some of the capabilities and the integration between a NetScaler, between the NetScaler Gateway, and XenApp and XenDesktop. Rich, sorry for going so long on that, but if we've got time for any questions, I'll be more than happy to field those from you.
Okay, Matthew, thanks. We only have a couple of minutes, and we have several questions. I have been getting a lot of questions if the webinar is recorded. The answer is yes, and so we will send everyone a link to the recording so you can forward it to a coworker or watch it again. Okay, so I'll just try to hammer through these. If you have to drop off, we obviously understand. Okay, first question, can we use one VIP for both the DNS and LDAP services?
Yes, absolutely. Those are going to be unique based off of port and IP address combination. So you could use the same IP on port 53 for DNS, same IP on TCP port 389 for LDAP. And so yes, you could conserve your IP addresses that way.
Okay. How do you know if the connection is persistent or non-persistent?
Good question. And that's really the big topic of the day. Usually your application developers are going to tell you. And if you're a network engineering guy, usually that's a little bit out of the realm of our expertise. So hopefully you've got somebody that works with the application that can kind of explain what's going on with it. Otherwise, you're just kind of left with, let's set it up, let's try it without. If it doesn't work properly, maybe that's one of the things that we toggle in and actually say, let's see if persistence fixes it. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you'll find really good load balancing guides, or you'll take a class like ours that'll just tell you flat out, web interface, you need it. XML brokers, you don't. But sometimes that is a little bit tricky to actually find.
Okay, great. Is secure LDAP still required for password changes?
Is secure LDAP still required for password changes? Yes, it is. And I didn't go in and set that up on there, but the idea is when a user comes in and interacts with the gateway, that may be their only experience with your environment. So they're never out of Windows box to go in and do a Control-Alt-Delete, log in and change their password. So you can support that through the gateway. You can support that through storefront, but secure LDAP is a requirement for that.
Okay, next question. Can we use gateway functionality just for EPA check to verify device identity before allowing access to the applications?
Great question. Yes, and you're getting into a little bit of the advanced functionality of the gateway, but what we can do is we can actually do an endpoint analysis scan where we actually look at the end user device and make sure they meet certain requirements, and then we can actually say, you can't come in at all. So the login box never comes up because you don't meet whatever the requirements are. Or we can go in, and if you're talking about XenApp and XenDesktop, you've got on the Platinum editions, you've got what's called Smart Access, where we can scan on the front end and based on those results, discriminate how we treat you on the back end. So you may get all your applications because you're coming in from a corporate issued laptop. Or we might let you in, but, and then we can restrict client drive access, things like that, as needed.
Okay, great. Okay, let's see. Is gateway this is a question about licensing for gateway. So is it part of a license version like standard or enterprise or platinum, or how is it licensed?
Okay, great question. There's a couple different ways this can go. You could actually purchase what's called the NetScaler Gateway only, and so that's the only functionality you have. You're not going to be doing any load balancing policies or anything like that. It's a virtual appliance, and that's all it will do. If you have an application delivery controller in standard, enterprise, or platinum versions, Gateway is a feature on that box, and you can go in and do basic ICA proxy with it. If you need endpoint analysis or full SSL VPN, you do have a universal license that you need to purchase for a certain quantity, but just for ICA proxy, any of the NetScaler versions will give you that functionality.
Okay, great. This is a question about SSL VPN. Can you do endpoint device inspection?
Yes, that's what the endpoint analysis is. They'll come in and they'll be prompted to download a piece of software. They've got that for Windows boxes. They've got it for Mac. And then in 10.5 and newer, they've got an advanced endpoint analysis engine to look a little bit deeper. So we can look natively for domain membership, certain versions of antivirus, things like that. And so we can go in and use that for Gateway for ICA proxy or Gateway for full SSL VPN.
Okay, next question. Can you configure Insight Center while the users are logged in?
Can you configure the Insight Center while the users are logged in? Yes, you can go in and configure that. You may not necessarily get all of the statistics for the ones that are there, but it's not going to go in and actually cause any problems with your existing connections.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to read this one. Hopefully it makes sense. Are there known issues with app flow, logging, and performance on XenDesktop? This individual, sounds like whenever it's enabled, there's always a slow response from the VDI.
Okay, there's a couple of different things there. One thing is you really need to be careful with your version of Insight Center and your version of the NetScaler. And sometimes they come out with cool bells and whistles for Insight, and you may not necessarily be at the same new version with the NetScaler. So when you go in and start introducing mismatches there, that can really go in and impact performance or worse. And so that's one of the big gotchas you got to watch out for. Beyond that, yes, there are some known hiccups with going in and pulling that information and how it can go in and cause your director monitoring piece to actually behave.
Okay, great. So what is the benefit or the difference to having NetScaler load balance the delivery controllers versus the native setup, adding them to storefront directly? Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, good question. That is going to be a very basic load balancing method. So what it's going to do is you've got two options, and it will round robin between them. Storefront is not going to do anything related to active monitoring to make sure that when it goes in and talks to a delivery controller, that it's actually up. It can handle a failover, so if it does talk to a down virtual server, it's going to remove it from load balancing, but it doesn't go in and do anything actively to prevent that. And so you switch the load balancing to the NetScaler, you get the intelligent load balancing instead of basic round robin, and you get the active monitoring capability instead of respond to a fault, basically.
Okay, excellent. On behalf of Matthew and LayerA Training, I once again want to thank everyone that joined our webinar today. And if you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is really easy to remember. It's rich@layer8training.com. You can also reach us at info@layer8training.com. And of course, our website, layer8training.com. Thanks again, and have a terrific rest of your week.
Thank you, guys.